The first night in that house was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Not peaceful, not calm, just controlled. The man I had been hired to care for sat across the room, staring at the wall like it held a conversation I could not hear. His file said he was unstable, dangerous on bad days, confused most of the time. That was what everyone told me. But the moment I stepped inside, something felt wrong. Not about him, about the house, about the job. About the way the agency rushed my paperwork without looking me in the eye. And about the phone call my husband made the week before he left. He told someone, very calmly, that I would be out of the way soon. When my husband left, he did not argue. There was no raised voice, no accusations, just a quiet conversation at the kitchen table, early in the morning while the coffee machine hummed behind us. He said he needed space. He said the marriage had become heavy. He said he thought we both needed time to think. He spoke in a calm voice that sounded rehearsed. I remember noticing that he avoided looking directly at me. His eyes kept drifting toward the window above the sink, as if he expected something outside to interrupt us. I listened. That was what I had always done best. Listening had been the foundation of most of my life. My work, my marriage, even my friendships. I had never been a person who rushed to react. I believed problems revealed themselves over time if you allowed silence to exist long enough. So I nodded when he spoke. I asked a few careful questions. None of them seemed to matter. By the end of the conversation, he had already packed a small suitcase and placed it beside the front door. He did not ask if he could come back later. He did not promise anything about the future. He simply said he would call once he had sorted things out. Then he left. The house felt unusually large after that. Not empty, just wider somehow. The quiet seemed to stretch through the rooms in a way I had never noticed before. For the first 2 days, I maintained my routine. I woke at 6 in the morning. I made coffee. I checked my email and the news while the sun moved slowly across the kitchen floor. My job at the care facility had ended a month earlier when the building closed due to funding issues. I had worked there for almost 9 years, assisting patients who required long-term observation. Most of them struggled with psychological conditions that made everyday life difficult. It was work that required patience, calm voices, predictable routines. The patients trusted people who did not react quickly. They trusted people who allowed silence to exist without filling it with pressure. I had always been good at that. But without the job, and without my husband moving quietly through the house in the evenings, the days began to blur together. I did not panic about the money at first. We had some savings. My husband handled most of the finances, and he had always been careful. At least, that was what I believed. 3 days after he left, the agency called. The woman on the phone introduced herself quickly, speaking in a tone that sounded both professional and impatient. She said they had received my resume from the care facility administrator before the building closed. She explained they were looking for someone with experience in long-term behavioral observation, private care, live-in position. The client required supervision during evening and nighttime hours. They preferred someone who was calm, discreet, and comfortable with isolation. The salary she mentioned was higher than anything I had earned before, not dramatically higher, but enough to make the offer feel like a solution. I asked a few questions about the patient. She described him as a man in his late 50s who had experienced severe psychological instability. According to the file, his condition caused periods of confusion, paranoia, and emotional volatility. He lived alone in a large house outside the city. A small rotation of caregivers managed the daytime hours, but the agency needed someone stable enough to handle the overnight shift long-term. someone who would not react emotionally to unusual behavior, someone who understood that patients sometimes said things that were not grounded in reality. I told her I would need to review the documents. She agreed, but her response came with a small pause that I noticed immediately. "We do need someone soon," she said. "Very soon." The paperwork arrived that afternoon. Medical history, behavioral notes, safety guidelines. Most of the language was familiar to me. It followed the same patterns I had seen in institutional care files for years. The patient had a history of mistrust toward medical staff. He occasionally believed people around him were conspiring against him. Those beliefs were described as symptoms of his instability. The agency emphasized the importance of not validating those ideas. Remain calm. Do not challenge him aggressively. Redirect conversation when necessary. The documents were clear, routine, predictable. The house itself was mentioned only briefly. A private residence located about 40 minutes outside the city. Quiet area, limited neighbors. The agency would handle transportation and food deliveries. My responsibility would be simple: observation, documentation, and maintaining a stable environment during nighttime hours. I sat at the kitchen table reading the file twice. Nothing in it seemed unusual. Nothing felt dangerous. And after 3 quiet days in a house that had suddenly become too large for one person, the idea of having a purpose again felt steady. I signed the contract that evening. The agency scheduled my start date for the following week. They thanked me for accepting the position with a tone that sounded almost relieved. At the time, I believed I was stepping back into the kind of work I understood. Calm environments, unstable patients, systems designed to manage complicated people. What I did not realize then was that the system surrounding this job had already decided something about me. Something I had not yet seen, and something my husband seemed to understand before he walked out of our house with that small suitcase. The house was farther from the city than I expected. The agency driver picked me up early in the afternoon and said very little during the trip. He followed a highway for nearly half an hour before turning onto smaller roads that grew quieter with every mile. The neighborhoods disappeared gradually. First the apartment buildings, then the stores, then even the small gas stations that usually sat at the edge of rural areas. After a while, the road felt almost private. Tall trees lined both sides, creating long shadows across the pavement. The driver kept both hands on the wheel and did not attempt conversation. When I asked a simple question about the schedule for the other caregivers, he answered politely but briefly. "Day staff leaves before 6, he said. "You take over after that." Nothing else. The house appeared suddenly after a long curve in the road. It was larger than the photos in the file suggested. A wide structure of dark stone and glass set back from the road behind a tall metal gate. The property itself looked carefully maintained, trimmed grass, clean pathways, no visible neglect. But there were no nearby houses, no visible neighbors, just trees stretching in every direction beyond the fence. The driver pressed a small button attached to the dashboard. The gate opened slowly, almost silently, and we drove through. I remember noticing the cameras first. They were mounted high along the corners of the house and near the entrance gate. That was not unusual for private properties, but there were more than I expected. Some faced the driveway. Others pointed toward the surrounding woods. The driver parked near the front door and helped me carry my single suitcase inside. The interior of the house was quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a family home, but the controlled quiet of a place that had been arranged carefully. The furniture was expensive but minimal. Clean lines, neutral colors, nothing personal displayed in the open spaces. A woman from the day's staff met us in the entry hall. She introduced herself as Clara and shook my hand with a tired smile. Her voice was polite, but I noticed the way her eyes moved quickly toward the driver before returning to me, as if checking something. She walked me through the main areas of the house: kitchen, living room, a hallway that led to several locked doors. "The client spends most evenings in the study," she said. "He prefers quiet environments." Her tone was neutral, almost rehearsed. I asked how long she had been working there. "About 4 months," she replied. Then she added very quickly, "It's temporary for me." The explanation seemed unnecessary, but she did not elaborate. We reached the study at the end of the hallway. The door was open. The man sat inside at a large wooden desk facing a wide window that overlooked the trees behind the house. He did not turn when we entered the room. Clara spoke gently. "Sir, the night caregiver has arrived." He did not answer immediately. For several seconds, he remained completely still. Then he turned his head slightly and looked at me. His expression was not what I expected. The medical file had described him as unstable, confused during most interactions, occasionally hostile toward strangers. But the man looking at me now seemed calm, very calm. His eyes moved slowly, studying my face in a way that felt deliberate rather than disoriented. There was no anger in his expression, no visible confusion, just observation. Clara stepped forward and spoke again. "This is your new overnight caregiver," she said. "She'll be here every evening." The man nodded once, a small movement. Then he looked back toward the window. The entire interaction lasted less than 20 seconds. Clara guided me back into the hallway. "He usually keeps to himself," she explained. "If he starts talking about people watching him or controlling things, just redirect the conversation." I nodded. The advice was familiar. Patients with paranoia often built detailed explanations around their fears. The key was not to validate them. We continued the tour. She showed me the small bedroom where I would sleep during quiet hours and the cabinet where observation forms were stored. Everything followed standard procedure. But one detail stayed with me. The doors along the hallway were locked, all of them. I asked Clara what the rooms were used for. "Storage," she said quickly. Then she changed the subject, explaining the meal schedule and the timing of the evening medications. When the agency driver left, the house felt noticeably quieter. Clara gathered her things and prepared to leave as well. At the door, she hesitated. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something more. Instead, she simply looked at me and said, "If anything feels strange, write it down." Then she stepped outside. The gate closed behind her car. I stood alone in the entry hall, listening to the silence settle back into the house. From the study at the end of the hallway, I could see the man still sitting at the desk, watching the trees, not moving. The file described him as unpredictable. But as the evening settled in, the first feeling that reached me was not fear. It was the quiet sense that the house itself had been arranged to watch something, and I was no longer sure what that something was. The first few nights followed a routine that appeared simple on the surface. At 6 in the evening, the day caregiver left the house. The gate closed behind her car, and the quiet returned almost immediately. I prepared a light dinner in the kitchen, placed a tray outside the study door, and waited for the man to retrieve it. Sometimes he ate. Sometimes he did not. When he did, he carried the empty tray back into the hallway and placed it carefully on a small table beside the door. He never spoke during those exchanges. At least, not at first. The observation forms required short entries every hour. Behavior stable. No agitation. No verbal hostility. The file had prepared me for emotional outbursts or confused conversations, but those things never happened. Instead, the man moved through the house with slow, deliberate awareness. He walked quietly. He avoided unnecessary contact, and he watched. Not in the restless way some patients watched their surroundings when anxiety was building. His attention felt controlled, measured. On the third evening, I noticed the first inconsistency. I was sitting at the small desk in the hallway filling out the hourly report when the study door opened behind me. He stepped into the hallway without making a sound. I looked up. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he asked a question in a calm, steady voice. "How long have you worked for them?" The clarity of his tone caught me off guard. Patients with severe instability usually spoke in fragmented thoughts when paranoia surfaced. Their language reflected the confusion inside their thinking. But his questions sounded precise, almost professional. I answered carefully. "This is my first week here." He studied my face for a moment, then he asked another question. "Did they tell you why I'm here?" The training guidelines from the agency moved through my mind automatically. Do not validate delusional beliefs, redirect conversation, maintain calm neutrality. "They explained that you're receiving long-term care," I said. The man did not react with anger. He simply nodded once. "I see," he said quietly. Then he returned to the study and closed the door. The conversation ended as quickly as it began, but something about it remained with me for the rest of the night. The file described a man who frequently believed people were conspiring against him, yet when he spoke, he did not sound frightened. He sounded curious. 2 days later, the second inconsistency appeared. A delivery van arrived late in the afternoon with several boxes of supplies. I met the driver at the door while Clara finished her shift. The driver carried the packages inside and glanced toward the study hallway. "Is he doing all right today?" he asked. The question sounded casual, but the way he asked it felt strange, not cautious, respectful. "Stable," I replied. The driver nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "Good." His tone suggested familiarity rather than concern. As he left, he looked toward the study hallway once more before walking back to the van. Clara watched him through the front window. "Do the delivery drivers come often?" I asked. "Sometimes," she said. Her answer was short. Then she checked the time and gathered her things quickly. Before leaving, she handed me the clipboard containing the observation forms. "Just continue the notes like usual," she said. Her voice sounded normal, but I noticed something again. She did not look toward the study door while speaking, as if avoiding it. Later that evening, I reviewed the medical file again. Something about the records had begun to feel incomplete. The documents described years of treatment for psychological instability, hospitalizations, medication adjustments, behavioral evaluations, but many of the reports ended abruptly. There were references to legal proceedings that had been resolved privately, references to professional affiliations that were listed but never explained. One section mentioned that the patient had previously held significant administrative authority in a financial institution. That line caught my attention. It was not unusual for patients to have professional backgrounds before mental health crises disrupted their lives. But the file did not include a single detail about what that position had been. No company name, no timeline, just the vague phrase, significant administrative authority. As I closed the folder, I realized something else. The man inside the study had never once displayed the behaviors described in the file. No paranoia, no aggression, no confusion, only observation. Late that night, as I walked past the study door to complete the hourly report, I heard his voice again. Quiet, calm. "You read the file tonight," he said from inside the room. I stopped. The door was closed. "How did you know?" I asked. There was a short silence before he answered. "Because everyone does," he said. Then he added something that stayed with me long after the hallway returned to silence. Eventually, they realize it doesn't explain anything. The first time I called the agency, I tried to keep my questions simple. I waited until the afternoon before my shift began. The house was quiet, and the sun was moving slowly across the kitchen floor in the same way it had during the days after my husband left. I sat at the table with the patient's file open in front of me. There were several details that no longer made sense: the gaps in the records, the unfinished legal references, the way the man spoke when he thought no one was observing him as a patient, and the behavior of the people who came and went from the house. I dialed the number listed for the agency supervisor. She answered on the second ring. Her voice sounded warm at first, professional, controlled. "Good afternoon," she said. "How are things at the residence?" "Stable," I replied. That word had become part of the routine. There was a brief pause on the line. Then I asked the first question. "I've been reviewing the medical history again," I said. "Some of the earlier reports mention legal matters and previous employment, but there aren't many details." Another pause, this one slightly longer. "The client's history is complicated," she said finally. "We provide caregivers with only the information necessary to maintain safe supervision." Her tone was still polite. But something about it had shifted. I continued carefully. "I understand that. I just wanted to confirm something about his behavioral profile." "Yes, he hasn't displayed any of the instability described in the reports." The silence that followed was brief but noticeable. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality. Gentler, almost sympathetic. "Transitions can be stressful for caregivers," she said, "especially when they are adjusting to new environments." The answer did not address my question. I waited. After a moment, she continued. "We were informed that you recently experienced some personal changes," she said. "Your husband leaving, for example." The statement landed in the conversation like a quiet weight. I had not mentioned my husband during any of the agency interviews. Not once. "Yes," I said slowly. "We try to be mindful of the emotional pressure that major life events can create," she continued. "Sometimes caregivers project stability onto patients because they need the environment to feel predictable." Her voice remained calm, careful, but the direction of the conversation had changed completely. The implication was subtle, not accusatory, just suggestive enough to shift the responsibility for my questions back onto me. I closed the patient file and looked at the kitchen window while she spoke. "I'm not projecting anything," I said quietly. "I'm describing behavior I've observed." Another pause, then a soft exhale from the other end of the line. "You were recommended to us because of your patience," she said, "and your ability to remain calm with difficult personalities." "I appreciate that," I replied, "but I still think some parts of the file may be incomplete." This time, the shift in her tone was unmistakable, still polite, but firmer. "Our documentation is reviewed by licensed professionals," she said. "If there were concerns about accuracy, they would have been addressed long before now." I understood the message. The records were correct. My interpretation was the variable, not the system, not the file, just me. The conversation ended shortly after that. She thanked me for my dedication to the patient's care and reminded me to continue documenting all observations carefully. When I hung up the phone, the kitchen felt unusually quiet. I returned to the house that evening with a feeling I could not easily name. Not fear, something closer to awareness. The man was already in the study when I arrived. The door was slightly open. He looked up from the desk when I walked past. "You spoke with them today," he said. It was not a question. I stopped in the hallway. "Yes. What did they tell you?" I thought about the supervisor's voice on the phone, her calm explanations, her quiet redirection of the conversation. "They said the records are accurate," I replied. and that my concerns may be influenced by personal stress. The man watched me carefully for several seconds, then he gave a small nod. That sounds like them. His voice held no anger, only recognition. I waited, expecting him to say something else. Instead, he returned his attention to the papers on the desk. The study door remained slightly open. Later that night, while completing the hourly observation forms, I noticed something new in the house. A small device mounted near the hallway ceiling. Black, circular, positioned where it could see both the study door and the desk where I filled out the reports. I was certain it had not been there the previous night. I stood beneath it for a moment, looking up. The camera lens was small, but unmistakable. The agency had not mentioned installing new monitoring equipment. They had not informed me that my observations were now being observed as well. From the study doorway, the man's voice drifted into the hallway. Quiet, measured. "They always increase the surveillance," he said, "when someone starts asking questions." The house fell silent again after that, and for the first time since accepting the job, I began to feel that the system managing this place was not simply observing the patient. It was studying me. The next few days passed with careful quiet. I did not call the agency again. I did not ask the day caregivers additional questions. Instead, I followed the routine exactly as it had been written in the file. Dinner at 6. Observation notes every hour. Minimal interaction unless the patient initiated conversation. But while the routine remained the same, my attention had changed. I began noticing details I had overlooked before. The camera in the hallway was not the only new device in the house. A second one appeared near the kitchen doorway 2 nights later. It was positioned at an angle that captured both the refrigerator and the table where I completed the observation reports during slower hours. Neither camera faced the study directly. Both faced me. The realization settled quietly in the back of my mind. Someone was watching how I behaved inside the house, not just how the patient behaved. Late one afternoon, a maintenance worker arrived to check the generator system located behind the property. Clara walked him through the side entrance while I prepared tea in the kitchen. The man removed his cap when he stepped inside. He glanced down the hallway toward the study. Then he lowered his voice. "Is he doing all right?" he asked. The question sounded familiar. It was almost identical to the one the delivery driver had asked days earlier. "He seems stable," I replied. The worker nodded slowly. "That's good," he said. His eyes drifted briefly toward the hallway cameras before returning to me. Then he added something unexpected. "He always was a calm man." The sentence was quiet, almost casual, but the word always caught my attention immediately. The file described years of psychological instability, hospitalizations, legal interventions, but the man standing in my kitchen spoke as if the patient's calm behavior was normal, not unusual. Clara returned from the hallway at that moment, and the conversation ended. The maintenance worker finished his inspection quickly and left without another word. Clara avoided my eyes while washing her hands at the sink. "He used to work here before," she said suddenly. Her voice sounded defensive. I had not asked a question. "Before what?" I replied. "Before everything changed." She dried her hands and moved toward the door. The explanation was incomplete, but she did not elaborate. I watched her leave through the front window. The gate closed behind her car. That evening, the house felt heavier than usual. The patient remained in the study with the door closed. I completed the observation reports and placed dinner outside the room. When the tray returned to the hallway table an hour later, I noticed something new beside it, a folded piece of paper. I picked it up slowly. It was not part of the official observation forms. The paper looked older, slightly yellowed at the edges. Inside was a printed document, a financial report. The header contained the name of a large investment firm, the kind that managed international accounts and corporate assets. Beneath the header was a list of internal administrative roles. One of the names had been circled in black ink, the patient's name. Next to it, a title, Chief Risk Officer. I stared at the page for several seconds. The file from the agency had never mentioned a position like that. It had described vague administrative authority, nothing more. From inside the study, the man spoke quietly. "You found the old records." His voice was calm. I stepped closer to the doorway. "You worked in finance," I said. The door opened slowly. He looked at the paper in my hand and nodded. "For a long time." "Why isn't that in the file?" A faint expression passed across his face, not amusement, something closer to fatigue. "Because it raises the wrong questions," he replied. The answer felt deliberate. "What questions?" I asked. He studied me carefully before responding. "The kind people stop asking when they are told someone is unstable." The hallway fell silent. The paper in my hand felt heavier now. "If you held that position," I said slowly, "there would be records everywhere, public filings, corporate documents." "There are," he said. "And what do they say happened?" The man leaned back slightly in the doorway. "They say I became paranoid," he said. "They say I accused several senior partners of manipulating internal risk reports." His tone remained calm. "Those accusations triggered a medical review, a psychological evaluation. And the evaluation concluded you were unstable," I said. He nodded once. "Conveniently." The word hung in the air between us. I thought about the agency supervisor's voice on the phone, her calm explanation, her quiet redirection toward my emotional state. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. The man looked toward the hallway cameras, then back at me. "Because eventually," he said quietly, "everyone who works in this house begins to notice the same thing." "What?" "That the system built to contain me is very careful about who they allow inside it." His gaze remained steady. "And you were brought here very quickly." The sentence settled slowly in my mind. The agency had called only 3 days after my husband left. They had rushed the paperwork. They had needed someone very soon. I folded the document carefully. The house was silent again, but the silence now carried a different weight. Because for the first time, the possibility entered my mind that this job had not been offered to me by coincidence. And if that was true, then someone had arranged for me to be here. After finding the document, I stopped assuming that anything inside the house was accidental. The routine continued. Dinner at 6. Observation notes every hour. Minimal interaction unless the patient spoke first. But the way I moved through the house changed. I began paying attention to the systems around me. The cameras, the deliveries, the timing of the agency's calls. Within 2 days, the supervisor began contacting me more frequently. Before, she called once every few evenings to confirm that everything remained stable. The conversations were short and professional. Now the calls came almost every night, always polite, always calm, but the questions had shifted. Has the client been cooperative? Has he said anything unusual? Have there been any conversations about his past? The last question appeared casually in the middle of the others. Each time I answered carefully. He has been calm, I said. No unusual behavior. The supervisor never challenged the answers directly, but the pauses between her questions grew slightly longer, as if she were waiting for something else. One evening, she added a new reminder before ending the call. Please remember that the client sometimes attempts to manipulate caregivers, she said. That is common in patients with persecutory beliefs. I understand, I replied. Her voice softened slightly. We trust your judgment, she said, but it's important not to become emotionally involved in his stories. The line went quiet after that. When I returned to the hallway, the patient was standing near the study doorway. He had heard the conversation. "They always become more attentive when someone stays longer than expected," he said. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I continued filling out the observation form on the clipboard. "What were you accusing them of?" I asked finally. He leaned against the doorway. "Adjusting risk exposure reports before they reached regulatory review." The sentence was technical, but his tone remained steady. "Why would they do that?" I asked. "To hide losses," he said. "How large?" He did not answer right away. His eyes moved briefly toward the hallway cameras, then back to me. "Large enough that the firm would not survive the investigation." The house became very quiet after that. I wrote a short line in the observation report. "Client calm, no agitation." The pen moved slowly across the paper. "Did anyone believe you?" I asked. "A few people," he said. "And what happened to them?" He gave a small shrug. "Most left the company." The conversation ended there. But that night I noticed something new in the house. Another monitoring device. This one had been placed near the staircase leading to the second floor. It faced downward toward the hallway where I usually completed the observation forms. The position felt deliberate. 3 cameras now, all directed toward the areas where I worked. None facing the study desk where the patient spent most of his time. Later that week, another small change appeared. A courier delivered an envelope addressed to me. Not the patient, not the house, my name. I opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a printed statement from my bank. The account listed was one I rarely used, a small savings account that had remained mostly untouched for years. But the statement showed something unusual, a deposit, larger than any payment I had received before. The sender was listed only as the caregiving agency. I had not yet completed a full month of work. The contract specified that payment would occur at the end of the first cycle. Not before. I called the agency immediately. The supervisor answered with the same calm voice. "Yes," she said. "We processed an early payment for your convenience." "I didn't request it," I replied. "We understand," she said. "We simply wanted to ensure your transition into the position remained comfortable." The explanation felt rehearsed. "I prefer to follow the payment schedule in the contract," I said. A short silence followed. "That may not be necessary," she replied gently. "We value stability in long-term caregivers." When the call ended, I remained at the kitchen table staring at the statement. The deposit amount was precise, not random. Someone had calculated it carefully. Later that evening, I showed the paper to the patient. He studied it for a moment before handing it back. "They're investing in your silence," he said quietly. "I haven't said anything." "Not yet." The words settled heavily in the quiet kitchen. I folded the statement and placed it back inside the envelope. "What happens when caregivers start asking questions?" I asked. He looked toward the hallway. "Usually they leave," he said, or they stop asking." The house remained silent for a long time after that, but the thought he had introduced stayed with me. If the system managing this house expected people to leave, then someone had decided I would not. And if someone had made that decision, then the arrangement had likely begun long before I signed the contract. Late that night, while finishing the final observation report, I noticed something else in the hallway. A small red light blinking beside one of the cameras, recording. The lens was directed exactly at the desk where I wrote my notes. For a moment, I imagined the room on the other side of that camera. Someone watching. Someone waiting to see what I would do with the information slowly gathering inside this house. The pen in my hand felt heavier than before, because by then I understood something clearly. The patient was not the only person being evaluated here. I was. And somewhere beyond the walls of this quiet property, people were waiting to see which side of the system I would eventually stand on. The realization did not arrive as a sudden shock. It formed slowly, quietly, like a pattern becoming visible after enough pieces settle into place. By the third week in the house, I had stopped thinking of the job as temporary. Not because I planned to stay forever, but because the situation had grown larger than the work itself. The patient remained calm, consistent, nothing like the description in the file, and the system surrounding him had become increasingly careful about what I saw and what I asked. But the final connection appeared on an ordinary afternoon. I had returned to my own house briefly to collect a few personal items. The agency had arranged transportation the same way they always did, one of their drivers arriving quietly at the gate, saying very little during the trip. My house looked exactly as it had the day my husband left. The same silence, the same kitchen table, the same coffee cups still stored neatly in the cabinet. But when I opened the small desk drawer where we kept financial documents, I noticed something I had not seen before. A folder had been moved. Inside it were copies of several contracts related to the house we lived in, mortgage statements, insurance documents, the paperwork my husband usually managed. As I sorted through them, another envelope slid from the folder. Thin, unmarked. Inside was a printed email. The message had been sent 2 weeks before my husband left. The sender was the caregiving agency. The recipient was my husband. I read the first line twice before continuing. "We appreciate your cooperation in helping us secure a suitable caregiver for the residents." The words were calm, professional, but the implication was unmistakable. The message continued with logistical details about my experience in long-term patient supervision. My former employer had apparently provided a strong recommendation. At the bottom of the email was a line that made the room feel very quiet. "Your discretion in this arrangement is appreciated." There was no explanation attached. No additional context. Just the printed record of communication between my husband and the agency that had hired me. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The house felt different now, not because anything inside it had changed, because the shape of the situation had finally become visible. The agency had not simply discovered my resume after the care facility closed. They had been introduced to me by someone who knew exactly what kind of work I had done for years. Someone who understood that I would remain calm in unusual situations. Someone who knew I rarely reacted emotionally when things became complicated. My husband. The thought did not arrive with anger, just recognition. I folded the email carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Then I returned to the house outside the city that evening. The patient was in the study when I arrived. The hallway cameras blinked quietly as I walked past them. I placed the envelope on the desk inside the study without speaking. He looked down at it, then back at me. "You found the connection," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." He opened the envelope slowly and read the email. When he finished, he placed the paper back on the desk. "They needed someone who would not panic," he said. "Someone stable." "Why me?" I asked. He studied me for a moment before answering. "Because people who remain calm are easier to position inside a system." The sentence carried no judgment, just observation. I sat down across from him. "They expected me to ignore what I saw," I said. "Most people do," he replied. "Especially when they believe they are simply doing their job." The room remained quiet. The weight of the realization settled slowly in my chest. My husband had not just left the house. He had arranged something before he went. Something that placed me exactly where the agency needed me to be, inside this house, inside this system. observing a man who had been labeled unstable. The anger I might have felt years earlier never appeared. Instead, something else formed, a calm decision. "What happens if the system is wrong?" I asked. He looked toward the hallway cameras again. "They correct it quietly," he said, "or they protect it. And if someone documents what they see," his eyes returned to me, "then the system has to decide whether those records are more dangerous than the truth they contain." I nodded slowly. That night, I began keeping 2 sets of records: the official observation forms required by the agency, and a second notebook. In the second notebook, I wrote everything: the financial documents he had shown me, the timing of the agency's calls, the cameras appearing in the house, the early payment to my bank account, and the email connecting my husband to the arrangement. I did not confront the agency. I did not contact anyone outside the house. Instead, I continued the routine exactly as before. Calm, quiet, reliable, because by then I understood something clearly. The system surrounding this house believed it had placed the right person inside it, someone who would observe, someone who would remain silent. What they did not realize yet was that observation could work in more than one direction. The system did not collapse all at once. It shifted slowly, the way large institutions often do when small details begin moving in directions they did not predict. For several weeks after I began documenting everything, nothing appeared to change inside the house. The routine continued: dinner at 6, observation notes every hour, short calls from the agency's supervisor asking the same careful questions. The cameras remained. The blinking red lights watched quietly from the ceilings. But outside the house, something had started moving. The first sign came through the mail. A thick envelope addressed to the patient arrived one afternoon with the usual delivery van. The driver handed it to me without speaking, though his eyes lingered briefly on the study door the way they always did. Inside the envelope were legal documents, formal notices, requests for financial disclosures. The names of several regulatory agencies appeared across the pages. I placed the envelope on the study desk. The patient read through the documents slowly. When he finished, he set them aside and looked at me. "They've reopened something," he said. "Your case." "Something larger than my case." He did not elaborate, but over the following days, more envelopes arrived, more legal language, more requests for documentation related to the financial institution where he had once worked. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone had begun examining the situation again, and systems, once activated, had a tendency to keep moving. The agency supervisor called that evening. Her voice remained calm, but the questions were different. "Has the client received any outside correspondence recently?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. "What kind of correspondence?" "Legal documents." A short silence passed over the line. When she spoke again, her tone was carefully neutral. "If the client becomes agitated, please document it immediately." "He has remained calm," I said. Another pause. "Please remember that some individuals attempt to fabricate legal narratives to reinforce their beliefs," she added. The explanation sounded familiar, almost rehearsed, but something in her voice suggested that the situation had grown more complicated than before. After the call ended, I returned to the study. The patient was reviewing the documents again. "They're nervous," he said quietly. "The agency, everyone connected to it." I sat in the chair across from his desk. The second notebook containing my private records rested in my bag beside the door. I had already provided copies of those records to someone outside the system. A lawyer recommended by a former colleague from the care facility, not because I wanted to accuse anyone, simply because records have a way of becoming important once systems begin asking questions. "What happens now?" I asked. He leaned back in his chair. Now the systems that protected certain people begin protecting themselves instead. Within 2 weeks, the changes became visible. The agency's supervisor stopped calling every night. Then she stopped calling entirely. A different representative contacted the House once to confirm that the caregiving contract would end at the conclusion of the current payment cycle. No explanation, just a quiet administrative adjustment. Around the same time, the financial firm mentioned in the old document began appearing in news reports. Investigations, internal audits, senior partners stepping down for personal reasons. None of the reports mentioned the patient's name directly. But the language surrounding the events felt familiar. Risk exposure, internal reporting failures, regulatory reviews. One evening, while checking the mail, I noticed another envelope addressed to me. The return address belonged to a legal office. Inside was a short letter confirming that the documents I had submitted had been received and logged as part of an ongoing review. No dramatic language, no accusations, just acknowledgement that records existed. Across the study hallway, the patient continued reading quietly. The house remained calm, but the quiet now carried a different feeling. The systems that once controlled everything inside these walls were no longer perfectly certain, because somewhere beyond the cameras and contracts, the truth had begun moving through places they could not easily contain. My contract ended 3 weeks later. The agency sent a short message confirming that my services were no longer required. The explanation was administrative, restructuring, changes in care management, nothing unusual on paper. The driver who arrived to collect me was not the same one who had brought me to the house months earlier. He said very little during the trip back to the city. The trees along the road passed slowly outside the window, the same way they had the first day. But the silence inside the car felt different now. The house where I had lived with my husband was still waiting when I returned. The rooms looked unchanged. The kitchen table stood exactly where it always had, but the space felt smaller than before, less uncertain. Over the following months, small pieces of information continued appearing quietly in public records and financial news. The investment firm entered formal investigation. Several senior executives resigned. Regulatory agencies issued statements about internal reporting failures. None of those announcements mentioned the house outside the city. And none of them mentioned the man who had once served as chief risk officer. But systems rarely acknowledge the details that expose their weaknesses. They correct themselves quietly. My husband never contacted me again. I did not attempt to find him. The email I had discovered remained stored in a folder with the rest of the documents. Sometimes I think about the moment when he decided to arrange the job. The calm way he left the house that morning. The small suitcase waiting beside the door. Perhaps he believed the system would remain stable. Perhaps he believed I would simply do the work and stop asking questions. But silence has a particular quality when someone spends enough time inside it. Eventually, patterns appear. Records begin connecting to one another. Truth moves through places where words never need to be spoken. The last time I saw the patient, he stood in the study doorway as I carried my suitcase to the front hall. Neither of us said much, just a quiet acknowledgement. The gate closed behind me as I stepped into the car, and the house disappeared slowly behind the trees. No confrontation, no victory, just the quiet understanding that systems built on silence eventually leave records behind. And sometimes, someone is patient enough to notice them.